Close your eyes for a moment and imagine settling into the softest chair by a warm fireplace. Outside, the world grows quiet, and inside, we're about to share something extraordinary together. Tonight we'll journey back to a time when humanity reached for the moon, but not in the way you might expect. This isn't a story about rockets or famous astronauts, though they're part of it. This is about something far more intimate, far more human. Picture, if you will, a small factory in Delaware, where women with careful hands and steady hearts stitched together dreams that would carry men to another world. These weren't engineers or scientists. They were seamstresses, women who spent their days crafting bras and girdles, who suddenly found themselves tasked with creating the very garments that would protect astronauts in the vast emptiness of space. Can you imagine it? One day you're sewing elastic into a foundation garment. The next you're threading aircraft cables into joints that might mean the difference between life and death on the moon. Tonight we'll meet Eleanor Foraker, a supervisor from the baby products division who found herself responsible for suits that would walk on lunar soil. We'll step into that underground factory where women sang hymns while sewing layers of protection against the void. We'll feel the weight of every stitch, knowing that each one held a human life in balance. And we'll discover how these remarkable women, working in secret and shadow, became the invisible architects of humanity's greatest adventure. So settle in deeper, let your breathing slow, and prepare to be amazed by a story that's been waiting patiently in the margins of history. A story about the spacesuit seamstresses who stitched humanity's path to the stars. In the year 1962, when the world still marveled at the impossible dream of reaching the moon, NASA faced a peculiar problem. They needed someone to make spacesuits, garments so complex and vital that they would literally mean the difference between life and death in the vacuum of space. The logical choice seemed to be Hamilton Standard, a military powerhouse with decades of aerospace experience. But Hamilton Standard had an unusual partner in mind. Picture the boardrooms of NASA, filled with serious men in narrow ties and horn-rimmed glasses, as someone announced that the spacesuits for America's moon mission would be subcontracted to a company called Playtex. Yes, that Playtex. The makers of bras and girdles. You can almost feel the stunned silence in that room, can't you? The thought of explaining to Congress that the first man on the moon would be dressed by a lingerie company seemed almost absurd. Yet there was something in the way Playtex approached their craft, something in their understanding of how fabric could move with the human body, that caught the attention of those who understood the challenges ahead. But this marriage of military precision and intimate apparel was doomed from the start. Hamilton Standard believed in rigid engineering, in redundant pressurized bladders that would keep astronauts safe but barely able to move. Playtex engineers, drawing from their experience with form-fitting garments that moved with a woman's body, advocated for flexibility, for joints that could bend and stretch. The tension grew unbearable until February 1965, when Hamilton Standard convinced NASA to cut ties with the lingerie makers entirely. They argued that a consumer brand simply couldn't work within the complex confines of aerospace engineering. And so Playtex was cast aside, their dreams of reaching the moon seemingly over before they'd truly begun. But sometimes, dear listener, the most beautiful stories begin with what appears to be an ending. Imagine the quiet devastation in Dover, Delaware, when word came that Playtex had been dropped from the Apollo program. Dreams that had seemed within reach suddenly felt as distant as the moon itself. But then, something wonderful and terrible happened. NASA's chosen path crumbled. Hamilton Standard's Tiger suit proved so stiff and bulky that after a simulated moonwalk, the astronaut couldn't even fit back inside the capsule mock-up. The very rigidity they'd insisted upon had made the suits unusable. In the spring of 1965, NASA announced a desperate new competition. 6 weeks. That's all the time they would give contractors to create a working spacesuit. Hamilton Standard was invited, of course, as was David Clark Company. But not Playtex. The lingerie makers had been forgotten, dismissed, written off. That's when Len Shepard, a man who believed in second chances and impossible dreams, boarded an emergency flight to Houston. Picture him in that NASA office, making his passionate plea. Playtex would fund their own entry, he promised. They would compete without any financial support, putting everything on the line for one more chance to prove themselves. NASA, perhaps moved by desperation as much as curiosity, agreed. 6 weeks. No money. No support. Just a small team of 12 engineers and seamstresses against the aerospace giants. What followed was something that legends are made of. They worked around the clock, breaking into their own locked offices at night to access materials. Picture these dedicated souls, bent over their work by lamplight, stitching together humanity's future, one careful seam at a time. They perfected joints using materials that came straight from their bra production lines, neoprene and nylon tricot, that could bend and flex while maintaining a perfect seal. When July 1965 arrived, the testing began. 22 grueling trials that would determine the fate of the Apollo program. One by one, their competitors failed spectacularly. David Clark's helmet blew clean off during a pressure test. Hamilton Standard's suit expanded so much the astronaut couldn't fit back through the hatch. But Playtex's suit, born from lingerie materials and sewn with loving precision, passed 12 tests without a single failure. The silence in that testing facility must have been profound as NASA officials realized what had happened. There wasn't even a second-place finisher. The bra makers had not just competed with the aerospace giants. They had defeated them completely. Let me tell you about Eleanor Foraker, a woman whose name should be spoken alongside the great heroes of the space age. Ellie, as her friends called her, was 34 years old when she was plucked from the baby products division and given the most terrifying responsibility imaginable. With no aerospace background, no formal training in the complexities of space technology, she was asked to supervise the creation of garments that would protect human lives in the most hostile environment known to mankind. Can you imagine her terror? Picture her going home each night, sitting at her kitchen table, head in her hands, wondering how someone who made waterproof baby pants could possibly be qualified to create suits for the moon. She later confessed that she cried many nights, overwhelmed by the weight of knowing that a person's life depended on her work. But sometimes, dear listener, the most extraordinary leaders are forged not from confidence, but from the very fear that they might not be enough. When the 6-week competition began, Ellie became the coordinator of miracles. She organized her small team like a general preparing for battle, working 80-hour weeks, sleeping at the factory, eating meals hunched over half-finished suit components. Her background with latex baby pants, humble as it might have seemed, gave her an intuitive understanding of airtight seals that proved invaluable. She implemented systems that would make military officers proud. Each worker was assigned color-coded pins so that if one went missing, it could be traced back to its owner. When one seamstress repeatedly forgot pins inside her work area, Ellie did something that became legendary among the team. She jabbed the woman with one of those pins and said, "Feel that? Now imagine it puncturing an astronaut's life support system." It was tough love born from genuine terror about the consequences of even the smallest mistake. As the Apollo program progressed, the pressure took its toll. Ellie suffered 2 nervous breakdowns, her body and mind pushed beyond their limits by the constant weight of responsibility. She rarely left the plant, sometimes returning home for just 2 hours before anxiety drove her back to check on the work. Her colleagues found her asleep under half-finished suit components at dawn, her dreams haunted by seams and joints, and the faces of astronauts whose lives depended on every stitch. She had photographs of the astronauts laminated onto each workstation, with a simple caption that said everything: "Your stitches keep this man alive." When precision became absolute, when NASA demanded that stitches could not deviate by more than 1/32 of an inch, Ellie introduced magnifying lenses and stitch counting sessions that resembled meditation as much as manufacturing. Her most painful moment came when Buzz Aldrin's suit failed a thermal test. A tiny misalignment in the reflective layers, barely visible to the naked eye, could have meant death on the lunar surface. Ellie dismantled and reassembled that entire suit herself in 48 hours without sleep, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon and the desperate love of a mother. She knew that if an astronaut died because of her work, she would never forgive herself. Despite her crucial role in humanity's greatest adventure, Eleanor Foraker received no public recognition, no medals, no mention in the history books. She carried this quiet heroism until her death in 2004, having given everything to ensure that others could touch the stars. Step with me now into a world that existed in secret, hidden away in an unassuming factory in Dover, Delaware. Every morning at 6 o'clock, women who had spent their careers crafting intimate apparel passed through armed guards into a sterile clean room that had once been a girdle production floor. The transformation was startling and surreal. Picture these women, accustomed to the familiar rhythms of sewing elastic and lace, now donning sterile smocks and entering a space that felt more like a surgical theater than a sewing room. The materials they worked with seemed to come from another world entirely. Beta cloth, woven from silica fibers to resist the fires of space, scratched their hands raw. The rubber bladder layers smelled like tire factories, heavy and chemical in the close air of the clean room. Most jarring of all was the mental shift required. One day they might be sewing elastic for a girdle waistband, something soft and forgiving. The next, they were threading aircraft steel cables into shoulder joints that could snap under the wrong pressure in the vacuum of space. Security imposed a strange isolation on their world. The women couldn't speak of their work outside the factory walls, creating a hermetic community where conversations revolved around joint flexibility tests instead of neighborhood gossip, where the success or failure of a pressure seal mattered more than local weather. They developed rituals that resembled religious ceremonies more than industrial processes. Hands were washed in antibacterial solution every 30 minutes. Tools were sterilized and counted twice daily. To prevent static electricity that could damage delicate components, workers wore cotton-lined shoes and grounded themselves before touching any materials. The most haunting ritual was the pin audit. At the end of each shift, supervisors collected every single pin that had been issued that morning. If even one was missing, production stopped completely while they searched. Imagine the terror of knowing that a forgotten pin could choke an astronaut to death in the endless void. Annalie Minner lost sleep imagining such scenarios, picturing finished suits being 10-rayed in desperate searches for missing pins. In this pressure cooker environment, the women formed bonds deeper than friendship. They became sisters united by shared dread and common purpose. When hands trembled while sewing a $100,000 suit, they steadied each other. When someone had what they called stitch hysterics, panic attacks over imperfect seams, the others surrounded her with comfort and encouragement. They sang hymns during the most stressful tasks, their voices creating a gentle backdrop to work that held lives in balance. And in their isolation from NASA's mainstream engineering culture, something beautiful happened. When NASA engineers struggled with reinforcing shoulder bells, the seamstresses suggested a cross-bracing technique borrowed from bra underwire channels. This innovation, born from intimate apparel expertise, created the iconic silhouette of the Apollo spacesuit that we recognize today. In their quiet factory, away from the glare of publicity and the pressure of public attention, these women were literally stitching together humanity's future, one careful seam at a time. Each Apollo spacesuit was, in essence, a wearable spacecraft, and within its seemingly simple exterior lay 21 meticulously handcrafted layers, each one requiring skills that could only come from human hands and hearts. Let me take you through this armor against eternity, layer by precious layer. The innermost layer was liquid-cooled nylon trica, a material that came directly from Playtex's lingerie division. Its stretch was critical for temperature regulation, allowing cooling tubes to remain in contact with an astronaut's skin as he moved across the lunar landscape. Seamstress Arlene Thaleen described the next layer as painting liquid neoprene onto cotton gauze to make the pressure bladder, like frosting a deadly cake. Each brush stroke had to be perfect, each application smooth and even, because any imperfection could become a fatal weakness in the vacuum of space. The outer thermal micrometeoroid garment was perhaps the most complex piece of all, capable of withstanding temperature swings of 300 degrees Fahrenheit, using up to 17 layers of aluminized mylar. The seamstresses had to sew these layers without using pins, because even the tiniest puncture could compromise the suit's protection against micrometeorites traveling at incredible speeds. But it was the gloves that became the most agonizing component to create. Picture trying to sew 13 individual fingertips, each one containing multiple layers, each one needing to maintain flexibility while providing complete protection. Joanne Thompson spent 3 weeks working on a single finger joint for Neil Armstrong's gloves, understanding that his ability to grip tools on the lunar surface depended entirely on her craftsmanship. The precision required was obsessive and exhausting. Every seam was backlit for inspection, revealing imperfections invisible to the naked eye. Thread tension was tested hourly, because too tight meant inflexibility, too loose meant potential failure. When mistakes happened, they were catastrophic. Velma Breeding witnessed a glove explode during vacuum testing when a pinhole they'd missed allowed the glove to inflate like a balloon before bursting. She and her colleagues sobbed over those scraps for days, knowing that such a failure in space would have meant death. The psychological burden intensified as each suit neared completion. Every seamstress signed her work, knowing that her name would be inside the suit during the actual mission. When a suit failed a 1967 oxygen-to-leak test due to uneven stitching, Eleanor Foraker ordered it publicly cut apart in front of the entire team, a harsh but necessary reminder of what was at stake. The paranoia was understandable but overwhelming. Women would wake in the middle of the night, convinced they'd left a pin inside a suit, calling the night supervisor to double-check their workstations. The ultimate test came during what they called blind stitching, when multiple layers obscured visibility entirely. The seamstresses had to work by touch alone, guided by braille-like markings they developed. Doris Boise described it as sewing through 5 layers you couldn't see, like defusing a bomb while blindfolded. But this pressure forged extraordinary pride and dedication. When Charlie Duke's suit developed a tear just 3 days before Apollo 16's launch, Roberta Pilkington flew to Florida with replacement parts handcuffed to her wrist. She repaired the suit overnight in a Kennedy Space Center clean room, working on her first flight ever, later saying with quiet satisfaction, "That suit walked on the moon, my hands were on it." In every stitch, in every layer, these women had woven their hopes, their fears, and their love for the brave souls who would trust their lives to this 21-layer miracle between humanity and the infinite void. As the summer of 1969 unfolded, the Dover factory became the quiet epicenter of humanity's greatest adventure. In June, 3 men arrived for their final fittings: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. These were no longer just names on mission rosters. They were the human beings who would wear the suits these women had poured their hearts into. Neil Armstrong possessed a quiet intensity that impressed everyone who met him. Seamstress Gail Smith described how he would stand motionless for hours while they adjusted knee joints and shoulder connections, never complaining, never showing impatience. When they finished their work on his suit, he bowed slightly and said simply, "I trust your hands." Those 4 words carried the weight of the world. Buzz Aldrin proved more demanding, rejecting the flexibility of his gloves twice. Eleanor Foraker took this as a personal challenge, redesigning his thumb joint overnight using a technique she'd learned from maternity girdle panels. The irony was beautiful. Methods developed for expecting mothers helping a man reach for the moon. Each astronaut's photograph was laminated at the workstations, creating an intimate connection between seamstress and space traveler. The women knew their assigned astronaut's measurements, his preferences, his quirks. Eleanor assigned Aldrin to her most meticulous team, telling them with the gravity of a general addressing troops, "His life is yours now, so like it." The final week brought surreal contrasts that captured the strange intersection of ordinary and extraordinary. While seamstresses carefully packed spacesuits in titanium cases, local newspapers ran headlines about Playtex's latest girdle sales. The women existed simultaneously in 2 worlds, one of neighborhood concerns and everyday life, another where they held the fate of human space exploration in their skilled fingers. On July 6, 1969, the completed suits shipped to Kennedy Space Center, with armed escorts. The women held an impromptu prayer circle in the empty clean room, hands still marked with the tiny cuts and calluses that came from working with space-grade materials. "We'd done all we could," Annalie Minner remembered. "Now we just had to hope and pray we hadn't missed anything." The night of July 19th, as Apollo 11 approached the moon, haunted vigils played out across Dover. Eleanor Foraker paced her modest home, clutching a suit diagram, checking every seam against her memory one more time. Young Jean Wilson confessed her fears to her minister, whispering, "What if the flag I stitched onto Armstrong's shoulder comes loose in the vacuum?" Ruth Anna Ratledge gathered her children around the television, pointing to the grainy images and whispering with pride and terror, "See that blue layer in the suit? Mommy helped make that." The most poignant scene unfolded at the factory itself, where dozens of seamstresses broke security to gather after hours, crowding around a small television in the break room. They'd brought lunar-themed cakes and wore handmade pins reading Playtex to the moon, but their celebration was subdued, overshadowed by the magnitude of what they'd helped make possible. As the Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, these women who had sown its protection fell silent, holding hands, whispering prayers, waiting to see if their stitches would hold in the face of infinity. Their work was done. Now all they could do was watch and hope and trust in the love they'd sown into every seam. July 20th, 1969. In living rooms and factories across America, people gathered around television sets to witness something unprecedented in human history. But for the seamstresses of Dover, Delaware, this wasn't just a historic moment. It was the ultimate test of work that had consumed their lives for years. As Neil Armstrong descended that ladder, every stumble on the lunar soil sent gasps through the gathered women. Their expertise made them hypersensitive to dangers that others couldn't even imagine. When Armstrong slipped slightly near the lunar module's leg, Clyde Wasilkowski grabbed the arm of the woman next to her. "If his suit tears on that sharp edge," she couldn't finish the thought. They watched with the eyes of craftspeople who understood exactly what could go wrong. Joanne Thompson found herself critiquing Buzz Aldrin's enthusiastic bouncing across the lunar surface. "Stop jumping," she whispered to the television. "The crotch joint isn't designed for that kind of stress." The 7-second delay in the television broadcast made everything worse. When they saw something that looked dangerous, they had to wait those agonizing seconds to know if disaster had struck. The most harrowing moment for Eleanor Foraker came during the flag ceremony. Watching Armstrong struggle with the flagstaff, she murmured to herself, "The horizontal rod. We didn't test that torque on the suit shoulder." She held her breath until the flag finally locked into position, Armstrong's suit intact and functional. When Buzz Aldrin saluted that flag, exposing the palm stitching of his glove to the harsh lunar light, Jean Wilson burst into tears. "My seams are on the moon," she sobbed. It was triumph and terror and overwhelming pride all wrapped together in that single moment. At Mission Control, Playtex project manager Sonny Rame found himself yelling at the television, "Get him back inside," as Aldrin lingered longer than planned outside the lunar module. Every extra moment on the surface was another test of materials and craftsmanship that had never been designed for such extended exposure. In Dover, women hugged each other and passed tissues as they pointed at the television screen during close-up shots, recognizing their own handiwork in the suits that were making history. Seeing that flag I stitched flicker in the lunar wind, Roberta Pilkington said later. That pride never leaves you. It becomes part of your soul. But even in triumph, Eleanor Foraker's trained eye caught problems. As Armstrong prepared to re-enter the lunar module, she noticed his backpack scraping against the hatch edge, a design flaw she'd warned NASA about months earlier. The relief of successful moonwalking was immediately replaced by terror about the return. I vomited in the factory restroom, she later confessed. All I could see was his suit tearing on the way back in. The celebration at the Dover factory was oddly subdued. The women polished their equipment and cleaned their workstations, but they left Armstrong's station untouched, like a shrine to what they'd accomplished together. Hazel Fellows captured the bittersweet nature of their victory. We'd spent years in that room with these men, learning their measurements, understanding their needs. Now they were coming home safely, but we'd never touch their suits again. Our part of the story was over. As the astronauts safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, the seamstresses of Dover knew they had been part of something miraculous. Every stitch had held. Every seam had protected. Every layer had done its job in the face of temperatures and radiation and vacuum that no textile had ever been designed to withstand. They had literally sown humanity's path to the stars, and the stars had not found their work wanting. As the celebrations of Apollo 11's success echoed around the world, a different story began to unfold in the quiet factory in Dover. The women who had made the moon landing possible discovered that their victory would be a silent one, their contributions slowly fading from the official narrative like footprints in lunar dust. NASA's post-mission reports credited contractors and subcontractors in careful technical language, but somehow the human story of the seamstresses disappeared into bureaucratic abstractions. The 1970 commemorative film about Apollo featured rockets and computers and famous faces, but no mention of the women whose stitches had held life together in the vacuum of space. When Neil Armstrong visited Dover in 1971 for a quiet appreciation ceremony, he posed with company executives and engineers, but the factory floor where his suit had been born remained unvisited, its workers uncelebrated. Gene Wilson made a pilgrimage to the Smithsonian in 1972, drawn by an almost maternal need to see Armstrong's suit on display. She stood before the exhibit case, looking at layers she had helped create, seams she had perfected, materials she had cut and shaped with her own hands. The placard credited NASA contractors, with no mention of ILC Dover, no recognition of Playtex, no acknowledgement of the seamstresses who had made it all possible. "I touched that suit," she whispered to her husband later. "I spent weeks of my life on those seams, but according to that museum, it might as well have been made by nobody." The return to anonymity was painful in ways the women had never expected. Many found themselves hiding their involvement in the space program, telling neighbors they made industrial garments, rather than explaining about spacesuits and moonwalks. The work had been classified for so long that secrecy had become a habit, but now it felt like erasure. Hazel Fellows kept her NASA security badge in a drawer, taking it out sometimes just to remind herself that it had really happened. "My husband knew what I'd done," she said years later, "but our neighbors, they would have thought I was crazy, claiming I'd sewn for the moon." Some women found different ways to cope with their invisible heroism. A small group began secretly working on a quilt during their off hours, using scraps of the same materials they'd used for the spacesuits. For 50 years, They passed this quilt among themselves, adding pieces and stitches and embroidered messages that told their story in fabric and thread. The central panel bore a simple message that captured their quiet defiance. We held the line between life and the void. But time has a way of revealing hidden stories. In the 1990s, documentary filmmakers began tracking down the surviving seamstresses, recording their oral histories before their voices were lost forever. The Smithsonian finally added proper recognition in 2009 when curator Kathleen Lewis discovered workshop photographs buried deep in the archives. When Eleanor Foraker died in 2004, her family buried her with a moon rock replica and a nameplate reading "Ellie Suit Mom," a title that meant more to her than any official recognition ever could have. At a 2019 Apollo anniversary event, 89-year-old Joanne Thompson smiled when a young girl asked how bras had reached the moon. "Honey," she said with the patience of a grandmother and the pride of a pioneer, "we didn't send underwear up there. We sent love, one stitch at a time." Today, that secret quilt hangs in an unmarked hallway at ILC Dover, its location known only to a few. It stands as a testament to the women who stitched history but were written out of the story they made possible. Their legacy lives not in monuments or medals, but in the quiet knowledge that when humanity reached for the impossible, it was their skilled hands and steady hearts that made the reaching possible. And perhaps, dear listener, that's the most beautiful kind of heroism of all, the kind that asks for nothing in return except the satisfaction of work done with love, precision, and unshakable faith in the power of human hands to protect human dreams. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the darkness above us, the moon still remembers the touch of women who never expected fame, only the chance to help humanity reach for the stars.